Laundrette from Vivien Goldman on Revenge of the 80s Radio. While punk has been known as something of a men's club, some of the great artists of the genre were women. They're featured in a new book by Vivien, who is also known as the Punk Professor, Revenge of the ShePunks, a feminist music history from Poly Styrene to Pussy Riot. Vivien's with me now to talk about it. Welcome back to Revenge of the 80s Radio, Vivien.
Well, I'm glad to share our revenge. It's a revenge edition. Revenge of the 80s and meets Revenge of the ShePunks.
So that's what it was. I couldn't put my finger on it before, Vivien, but I really like that title for some reason. I get it. Before we start, you're NYU's professor of punk and reggae. We've talked about that before. Both genres are generally thought of as male-dominated historically. There were a lot of female punk legends in the 70s and 80s as well, and through today. How important is it to showcase them today?
I didn't even know that people regarded punk as a male-dominated genre until you just said so, because to me, it was so integral. It was the most revolutionary and fascinating aspect of the music to me. And, it was the first time that women had got a chance to express themselves in an unfiltered way and create an image that was not sort of similar to that of, say, the avatar of the great Joni Mitchell, who, Aryan, tall, blonde, and, finally women could come out in different shapes, sizes, and different sorts of attire and express themselves fully. It was really a first. It was a very revolutionary moment. I mean, for me personally, it changed my life because for the first time, even though I'd already been a music journalist, we were moving out of that old sort of cock rock paradigm and into a more equitable landscape, even though it wasn't, completely smooth and equal by any means. And I personally had a lot of conflict with old school rockists, yes. But it was a different world, and something like that had never happened before in the entertainment industry. And, the reverberations continue to this day. And not only, like what I'm trying to show in the book, is that people sometimes have this very reductive view of punk. I was definitely a participant in the West London scene and the UK scene, and then, around sort of Portobello Road, where on Lancaster Road, Joe Strummer's The Clash lived on the same street as the lead singer of the British reggae band Aswad, Brinsley Ford, and it was very much a tight community. And then similar thing happened in the Lower East Side and around CBGB's in New York. And people tend to think, oh, that's it, and maybe some stuff in LA. But no, it was a sort of rallying cry, especially for women artists, that continued to reverberate around the world and was even an inspiration, which I hadn't fully grasped till I did the proper research for the book, for the Riot Girl movement.
I guess I referred to it as a boys or men's type thing because they got all the coverage, it seemed like. Now, yes, new wave and punk music of the late 70s and 80s opened up a lot of new opportunities for women. I'm guessing because that audience wanted something different. And the fact is, women were finally somewhat allowed to rock in the 70s thanks to the emergence of your Suzi Quattros of the world. But the punk really gave them another place to go. The audience was looking for something different.
It wasn't only that. It was the atmosphere of the times, the zeitgeist, and the idea of DIY, so that people could make records themselves and not only be turning to the multinational labels, or the big establishment of the music industry to get their music and ideas and their voices heard. So, shifts in technology, shifts in attitude, and it was the artists themselves, and they found their audience. They found there was an audience. They created an audience. That's how I see it more. And in fact, it being punk, often the artists were the audience and vice versa. It was the original idea of it was to be egalitarian, to present a new way of, making art and enjoying art, because previously, there was still a big hangover from the big 60s bands, like The Who and Genesis and so on. But punk was determined to sort of shift gears on that one. And along with this new generation, more open-minded generation, women were allowed through, and women forced their way through.
Well, that was the key right there.
It was a life changer for me, because I'd seen what it was like before, or so frequently the only female in the room, and suddenly I had compadres, people like the Slits, or indeed Poly Styrene and X-Ray Specs, the Raincoats, the Modettes, the Delta 5, a whole crew. Suddenly there was a whole crew. It was fantastic. And, you're right, with a sort of very male-dominated media, maybe not enough attention was paid to it. I mean, I certainly at the time really went through it with certain of the team on the rock paper I was working on, Sounds. Even when I was the features editor, there was this attitude, girls have nothing to do with popular music. They felt girls had no rights to enter that domain. They felt it was a boys' club. But music belongs to everyone.
It does. And you said, no, take two. I'm sorry about that, Vivien. It does, Vivien. And with me is Vivien Goldman. Her new book is Revenge of the ShePunks. We're going to talk a bit more about that. But now that you bring that up, yes, the media types might have said that to you, but where did you go looking for interesting female-led bands to cover?
Well, I was already working in the business before punk. I mean, only by a matter of, maybe a year. But the music would come to us, like people would come to the office, like in Sounds, or when I was working at New Musical Express. You would get people coming into the office, Elvis Costello and the people from Stiff Records bringing badges. Malcolm McLaren would come in, the manager of the Sex Pistols, and they would seek us out. So yeah, people would be sending press releases, and I also used to hang out. So when I first wrote this 1976, I think it is, article that opens the book, it was a revelation for me, and I describe it. I can read you a little bit of it. It starts off, suddenly there seems to be an awful lot of women musicians or women bands in the Sounds gig guide. It seems that a women's underground is suddenly emerging overground. And they're a threat to men because they challenge male supremacy in a citadel that's never been attacked before. They threaten women who perhaps never dared acknowledge that they want to be on stage doing the energizing instead of watching their boyfriends do it in passive admiration. So I was noticing that on December the 11th, 1976, I managed to get the article in the paper. So yeah, I saw it on the stages of little clubs. Suddenly there was this whole crop of women musicians, and I described there how I go to this gig and I see a long-haired person in jeans, playing hard rocking guitar, and their hair is flailing. But that was still the time when a lot of men had long hair in rock bands. It wasn't at all unusual. So it was only when I got to the front of the stage I realized it was a girl. It was a life-changing moment for me because I'd never seen a girl play music in a band before. Susie Quattro was sort of a one-off, and she very much fitted the existing rock mold. She, a bit like Chrissie Hynde, kind of really loved to be one of the boys. And this one anonymous female guitarist who I saw at the time was also in that, sort of more classic rock mold. Not that Chrissy's classic rock, but you know what I mean.
Exactly.
Whereas some of the women who came forward were really developing an answer to a question that I did ask in print, which strikes me as unbelievably poignant now, where I was saying, if women got a chance, or more women got a chance to make music, what would it sound like? There was no body of work by female popular artists who weren't sort of singer-songwriters. I'm not talking about Cilla Black here. We all love Cilla Black and Dusty Springfield and so on. I'm talking about a different sort of sound, like the Slits and the Raincoats did develop, which is sometimes marked by shifting rhythms, quite dub influenced, more fluid, less structured, less four on the floor, less rigid.
Vivien Goldman, the punk professor, is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Her new book is Revenge of the ShePunks, a feminist music history from Poly Styrene to Pussy Riot. We're going to get into the book straight ahead on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Tika and the Dissidents, a contemporary band out of Jakarta. The song Tubuku Otoritasku, now I hope I have that right, but one of the bands featured in Vivien Goldman's book, Revenge of the ShePunks. That shows, though, that you're not just talking about the UK and US punk scenes. The movement spread around the world, also for women.
Yes. I was just talking about how people only thought of New York and London as the main punk centers, but, you know, in its reverberations around the world, it's still doing its job as a comparatively accessible form of music, especially for people who maybe have not had the role models and the experience that a lot of boys have who, you know, have always traditionally been in bands. And, you know, I actually did go on a little search for such women artists, and I found the scene to be, let's say, extremely rocking worldwide, of women shaped by punk and making punk music in all sorts of corners, like the Philippines, Colombia, all sorts of corners of, you know, parts of the planet. And among them was the wonderful Kartika Jaja from Tika and the Dissidents. And their best-known song is, as you were saying, Tubuku Otoritasku, and that means my body, my choice. So she was definitely shaped by punk, and she told me that in Indonesia, although they have, you know, very strong music tradition, it's really not that common to have women musicians. And she was breaking the mold and working with punk, where she'd also been inspired by people like Riot Girls, helped her face up to certain very challenging situations she'd had to deal with, like being raped. And she was able to actually express that forcefully in songs like My Body, My Choice, which you can actually see on YouTube. And it was very inspiring talking to her. You know, she was saying that she was doing Riot Girl-like zines, and she told me, mind you, this was the time of the Suharto regime, where the government could make you disappear if they thought you were too radical. They confiscated leftist literature and raided discussions on campuses, but they had a blind spot for zines because they had no idea what zines are. This is what she told me, and I write in the book. So we were a lot more free to write radical ideas and just express whatever we wanted through these zines, which were an amazing way of cheating censorship. So you see how that punk movement, far from grinding to a halt when post-punk came in the early 80s, just actually rolled along, you know, gaining size and gaining traction and impacting on women everywhere.
We played Tika and the Dissidents because it was among your suggested listening lists with each chapter of your book, Vivien.
Yes. Each chapter has a playlist, and the book is not chronological. It's thematic, which is actually the way I tend to view life and the way I approached previous book I did.
That's right, Vivien. Chronological's for the normies. This is punk, so you have to do it a different way.
I do tend to view things a bit laterally anyway, and a previous book I did together with a photographer, David Corio, called The Black Chord, you know, that was also thematic. I find it the most accurate way of approaching broad topics. And I literally did sit down and think, what are women's concerns? What are the consistent women's concerns that we've had to think through all through the years? So I came up basically with identity, the many, 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 many songs by punk women about identity, an extraordinary amount. And that's because the role of women was shifting so much. And, it's obviously something that's unbelievably relevant right now when rights like, as Tika was saying, rights over our bodies that we had thought we'd fought for in the earlier part of the 20th century and won are now literally being rolled back as we speak, right as you are listening to this show. So it's no wonder that girl musicians are so fascinated and feel they're so drawn to interpret their identity. So, it was hard selecting the songs for that one in particular, but it was a bit like that with all of these.
Think about it this way, Vivien. There are problems here in Britain and places like that, but a lot of women in these other countries that you've explored where the punk movements have really broadened out, they have it worse.
Well, they definitely, you're looking at a place like Colombia and in Russia. The interesting thing that I found in the book was that when you're facing a certain sorts of regimes that are known for being repressive, men and women tend to battle the establishment together. And gender issues tend not to be as dominant as they are here now. But I'm talking, on an American radio show, although it's on the internet, so anybody can hear it anywhere. But I'm talking as an American to Americans, because we're in a huge battle now. Right now, this very second, if you look at the newspapers, we're fighting for our rights in a way I wouldn't have imagined in the 80s when I thought most of these battles were done and dusted. But no, this book goes to show, and current events go to show that the struggle never ends. So I went on from identity to look at money, and then what I call love/unlove, and then protest. And I distilled, listened to a bunch of material. I distilled it down to just a few tracks per chapter and decided to focus on them. And so they're in a playlist on Spotify. So anybody who's got Spotify, hopefully I'll be able to broaden it out so that people won't have to be Spotify members to access the playlist. But even if you haven't got the book, if you've got Spotify, you can already start listening to the music.
Vivien Goldman is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. You can also watch the videos of these artists and the songs that Vivien lists in the book on YouTube. You can check them out and maybe pick them up on other digital outlets as well. But it's important to expose a lot of these great bands, these great artists that maybe without you aren't heard from here in the US, UK, or Australia.
As I say in the book, there has been a systemic move to kind of quash the forward progress that women made in music. Like, music is very fad and fashion driven anyway. We all know that. But the women would drop more quickly from the canon, in the public and media. There's no doubt their sounds were silenced. And, we see that happen in other art areas as well. In fact, you only have to look at the visual arts. And when you think of the amount of women artists who just never got a chance, what you might call the Shakespeare's sister syndrome, it's terrifying, horrifying, and depressing. So after that burst of punk, say UK went into a very pop boy band mode. The women didn't really get follow-up deals. They were somewhat erased. And then Riot Girls picked up the vibe in the 90s. And I remember thinking, wow, and what's happened to all that work we did, all those fabulous sounds? And at the time, I didn't even know that Riot Girls like Kathleen Hanna had been influenced by people like the Raincoats, which they were, but they weren't able to buy it on record. It was like smuggled bootleg cassettes that were passed around. Kurt Cobain was a big champion of the Raincoats. And he was one of the people who got to hear this music that had been quashed and lost, really, on cassettes, third generation cassettes that were passed around among fans, just that had kept the spirit alive. So it was really pushed underground. Then the Riot Girls, who had a very different sort of ambience and feel about them, they stepped forward in the 90s and really refreshed the debate, people suddenly remembered, yes, there were women making authentic and original music, sounds that had really never been heard before in popular music. Can we bring them back? And I remember I was on a compilation album called Girl Monster that was done in the 90s by Chicks on Speed, who were based in Europe. And they were determined. They contacted me. This was sort of really before there was much internet and email, and things weren't like they are now with the Facebook and so on. And they somehow tracked me down. They'd heard of me, and they wanted to include me on this album. So we had many talks, and we're still in those talks today. And they felt very strongly that they wanted to show there is an arc of female creativity, and not have it just ruptured and broken and abandoned, but pull it together. So that's sort of the direction I wanted to continue with this book. Since then, for example, there's been another music compilation that I'm also on called Sharon Signs to Cherry Red, which came out more recently on the Cherry Red label. And that is a fantastic compilation. And that amazed me when I listened to it, because it really made me think of the breadth of music that women had been making that had never got heard, because they pulled in a lot of indie stuff, DIY stuff, great stuff that I'd never heard. And it showed, I was used to my dub-oriented sister and fellow musicians and so on, but there was all sorts of popular music beyond punk too being made by girls, but they never really got the chance. And there's certain issues that do face women, especially in countries that, unlike, say, traditionally more progressive Scandinavia, would have, child care, situations like that. And simply the fact that women, the pay gap is such a huge problem that, women might not have had the money accessible to them to go off and do indie things. So there were various social and political factors inhibiting women extending their career. And then an often hostile music industry, because even today, it's not like it's a done deal. I remember there was a list not long ago, I think it was in GQ, but of the top DJs in the world, the 100 top earning DJs. It's such a shocker. There was, I think, one woman on it and one black person. So, the inequities of society, the music industry is not free of them. It's embedded in them. So women still have to be more proactive to even get the chances that the guys have traditionally got and always got. It's always like that. People don't like to give up power and give up money, and that's how they, instead of seeing it as giving them more power and more money, really, which is what it really is, because there's more active women in music, it's just more possibilities for everyone. But people get very protective and territorial.
It's true. And think about it this way. How many times can a woman hear from, like, when they were 5 or 6 years old, you can't do that because you're a girl?
Absolutely. Social conditioning. You hit it. So, even me, and my father was a musician, and I made some music in the 80s, which is still lasting today. People reissue it all the time. And of course, I had my own reissue a couple of years ago, Resolutionary, on the Stavgold label in 2016. We talked then. But to be real, I was as musical when I started writing about music as I was when I started making music. But I don't think it had really occurred to me. I just thought, I'm a writer, I'll be a writer. And maybe I could just see that the industry was so unwelcome, such an unwelcoming. It was unwelcoming for female writers. How much more so for female musicians that wanted to make an unprecedented sound. So I definitely was liberated by punk and finally having a female community of musical artists for the first time. Before, one did not exist. And now I've actually even made my first ever album, and I'm like a veteran. So I've made my first album. Funnily enough,
you said that was your first full album, even though you had the EPs and everything else out there before.
yes, I'd had 12 inches out before, but it was sort of scattered. And at a certain point, I already came to making music late for the pop industry, like when I was in my late 20s or early 30s. And I could see that there wasn't, it was really, really difficult they wanted you to be young, fresh meat. That was the way the business worked. And me personally, I do love writing, and I've always worked in various media. So I basically stopped doing music and went into television. That's what I did in the mid 80s, because I had those options, and because I felt, well, I'm just a musician inside. I can always sing with my friends. Nobody can take the music away from me. But I'm just going to use my sort of career time in a different arena right now. And then, luckily, with a shift in the zeitgeist, people called me back. I say luckily because I've been enjoying it. And I've actually done gigs, whereas when I was in groups like the Flying Lizards, and making my music with people like John Lydon of Pill and so on, I never played, I never performed. And it didn't cross my mind to perform. But now people are asking me to perform, and the audiences are really digging it. So, in fact, I'm doing my literally first ever show in a New York club on the 26th of this month in support of the really good artist Kate Le Bon at the club elsewhere in Brooklyn on the 26th of June this month. So this is unprecedented. So for me, new doors are opening, which is really exciting. And I've just made this album, and it's my first ever album. And it's just sort of turning all the expectations on its head, I think, whereas they're meant to dismiss you as a female musician once you get beyond a certain age, unless you're a jazz artist or blues artist. And it's very exciting times for me. I'm thrilled with this shift in the zeitgeist, and of course maybe it's happening all the more because women are being sort of really repressed now in America, specifically with their rights being taken away. So maybe that is pushing the zeitgeist more to be open to females among the people that really think that's revolting, that what's happening is revolting, which I do. So maybe that's making people keener to hear more sorts of voices like that, a mature female such as myself, This is unprecedented,
Well, the way I see it is a great performer is a great performer, regardless of gender. If you can rock,
Chris,
if you're that good, that's the way it should be.
Yes, Chris. If only everybody thought like you.
That's what I keep telling people. They should be thinking like me.
Yes, they should. They totally should. I'm not coming, when I say I'm feminist and writing a feminist book, I'm not one of those people that is down with men, if
I know
such
that.
still
Yes.
exist. I'm just not a separatist. I loathe separatism, although I understand it as a necessary tactic at certain stages in a revolutionary struggle. I remember when I interviewed Public Enemy, I asked Chuck D this same point. Do you see separatism as an end in itself, or do you see it as a necessary step in creating change? And he said, absolutely the latter. Absolutely as a step on the path to create change. Because sometimes people feel a need to sort of trot off into their different sectors with people that are connected by birth or gender, say Catholics or Jews or women, that sometimes they want to cluster and exchange their own ideas. But to me, to have it stop there is just annoying, very annoying. It's not how I think life should be. I think it should just be empowering these groups to step forward and engage more fully. I'm really opposed to the separatism I see extending so much in America today, with people just breaking off into little clusters. I find it very disturbing, and it ties in, frankly, to me, with the rise of the right wing and fascism around the world. It's very, very alarming. It's the reverse of what people like me and other punks, people even since the hippies, had thought was going to occur. We thought, as I was saying earlier, we thought a lot of the battles had been won, and that we were going to try and be a planet on which the species of human beings would work together more closely to try and create, a better functioning world, a more equitable world. But it doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, because the people who try to do that are incredibly irresponsible, and they are bent on total world domination, and that's unfortunate too. So you can't win.
Well, we have to say we can win, au contraire. We have to say we can win. We can't let it bring us down. This is very much the mood, actually, in which I've written the songs on this album that I've done with Youth of Killing Joke, who produced Poly Styrene's final album, which I gather you're going to play a track from at the end of the show, so I'm very excited about that. So Youth of Killing Joke, you've probably heard of Killing Joke?
Yes, we play them regularly. Yeah.
Yeah, so Youth, the bass player, and that was an incredible experience working with him. I have to say he's a real visionary with sound. It's like working with somebody with, such a distinctive approach, like, say, the famous dub master Lee Perry. Youth, too, has a really powerful, personal approach to sound, and it's been exhilarating working with him.
Vivien Goldman, I want to thank you for coming out with us today. The book, Revenge of the ShePunks, A Feminist Music History from Poly Styrene to Pussy Riot. And you have a new album out. We're looking forward to that. The shows you're going to be performing to support it. Good luck with everything, Vivien.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'm very glad that we were able to have this meta moment where, as they would say in the world of reggae, where two revenges clash.
Revenge is sweet, especially with a nice bowl of ice cream. There we go. Let's play a song by one of the female punk pioneers you discuss in depth in the book, Poly Styrene. But this will be from her 2011 solo album, her final solo album, Generation Indigo, Virtual Boyfriend, on Revenge of the 80s Radio.